Next up is Kimberly Christen Wythe. She is Director of the Digital Projects Native Programs, and she wears a lot of hats, and co-director of the Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation at Washington State University. Kim will be divulging her topic and question in the early part of her presentation. So take it away.
Thanks, Josh. I want to thank everybody for coming and for NEH for putting this on, and mostly to Josh for wrangling all of us and our slides and getting everything together. Thank you for that. So I want to sort of go back to my academic roots here, and I want to use the notion of keeping while giving that anthropologist Annette Weiner coined in the early 1990s to define a more nuanced understanding of reciprocity in relation to what she calls inalienable possessions, to help us think with, as we sort of engage with this question that was set before me. But before I do that, how many closet anthropologists are there in the crowd? See, they're everywhere. We're everywhere. Yes, so this will be good. This will be good fun. Okay, so the question I was given was, what ethical practices ought to guide our collaborations as we preserve and provide access to audiovisual collections? So I believe that there is an urgency that accompanies answering this question, not an urgency that is steeped in notions of salvage preservation or victimhood or dependency, but instead an urgency and an immediacy that follows specifically from the history of collecting of indigenous peoples' songs, languages, rituals, and oral histories that provides us with an opportunity to chart a different future. Images like this remind us that the history of audiovisual collections and collecting cannot be detached from the histories of colonialism. Most of the recordings in non-indigenous repositories, whether they be federal, state, indigenous, university archives and libraries, have fraught, violent, and complicated histories of taking and giving. These materials are, in Weiner's terms, inalienable possessions. They're the songs, the ceremonies, and the traditional knowledge that cannot be bought and sold, given away to keep permanently. Instead, and in what I'm suggesting here, is that the very act of recording was and is one of giving, taking, receiving, and keeping that has the potential to bind people in long-term, mutually respectful relationships. We can act now, in this moment, from a sense of purposeful agency, with the clear intention of removing some of that colonial residue from these records and relationships, and replacing them with practices of reciprocity and belonging that promote, first, stewardship. Stewardship as a set of ongoing practices and relations around audiovisual belongings that begin with care, and that invite a set of long-term collaborations. So two things to note here about these collaborations and collections. The cultural heritage materials we're dealing with are part of dynamic, ongoing sets of relations for individuals, families, and communities around the world today. And most of these people, communities, and individuals have not had access to these materials. So in stewarding these materials, we have an obligation to act not just to digitally preserve the materials, but to also, and at the same time, promote and provide access in ethical ways that both unite communities and collections and invite a collaborative curation process, the results of which may be different types and forms of access, narration, and circulation of those very materials. So to highlight what this might look like, or what it does look like, I want to give you an example of a project that I've been involved with over the last 5 years that threads many of these things together. The Ancestral Voices Project is a collaboration between the Library of Congress, American Folklife Center, the Passamaquoddy Nation of Maine, Washington State University, and New York University. So in 2011, under the directive of the Librarian of Congress, the AFC, along with the library's National Audiovisual Conservation Center, purposely set out to preserve and provide access to some of the earliest and most rare audio collections they held, wax cylinder recordings, of which there are thousands in the library's collection. Specifically, though, for this project, we focused on the 1890 recordings of anthropologist Jesse Walter Fuchs. Fuchs set out in 1890 to test Thomas Alva Edison's silver phonograph cylinder, could have been silver, cylinder phonographic recorder, first in Calais, Maine, with the Passamaquoddy community. Prior to heading to the Southwest, which was really the end goal, part of a salvage mission to document fading and supposedly dying cultures and languages. So after 126 years, the AFC was able to use a new tool called the archaeophone to extract audio content from the wax cylinders directly to digital audio. And then with some sonic restoration as well, there are now 31 digital files for return to the Passamaquoddy from that 1890 session. Over the last 7 months, we've worked with the community to have listening sessions. And importantly, we left the recordings there so the community could have their own listening sessions. During our first session, we gathered with the Passamaquoddy language teachers, this preschool immersion class, as well as elders to have a first listen to some of the cleaned up audio files. Here's one of the files that we listened to, a traitors song sung by Peter Selmore in 1890. As we listened the second time through, though, we started, what started as listening quickly became singing by Gracie Davis, then another, many young and old. I also want to say that the StoryCorps keynote this morning really reminded me of this, because being at these is that same sort of powerful moment. And I think, when this happened and this moment happened, it was right there. We knew why. After 126 years, for community members, second, third time, to have these songs and language and material back, and to have the immersion preschool kids, running around in the classroom, it was one of those moments when you know why you do what you do. So during those listening sessions, since then, we've talked to the community. They've isolated words. They've used them in their language classes. A group of teenagers, even though they don't understand the words, have created new songs with the beats. So we know also from these community consultations, though, that there are a portion of these 31 cylinders and now digital files that contain culturally sensitive materials that are not meant for public consumption or circulation, even though they were recorded as such. So preservation and consultation have led to access and curation decisions as part of a new set of relationships around keeping, giving, and the return of materials. So in order to embed these community protocols and provide access based on community parameters, we're using Mukurtu, Mukurtu CMS was developed first out of my work in Central Australia and has now grown into, with the funding from NEH and the IMLS, a free and open source content management system and community archive platform. It's designed specifically with the needs of Indigenous communities in mind. And what I mean by that is Mukurtu allows for local protocol-driven curation and circulation and access of materials. So if, for example, that song should only be heard by community members, within the archive they could designate it as such. That one isn't. We were given permission by Gracie Davis to play that song. So. Mukurtu also allows for multiple layers of community narration, and Mukurtu is now completely configurable and customizable to the cultural, social, and linguistic needs of any size community, cultural center, library, archive, and museum. And alongside Mukurtu and growing from our first 3 years of development is the implementation of the Local Context Initiative. So Local Context is an online platform that provides educational materials and alternative sets of intellectual property rights initiatives specifically for Indigenous cultural heritage that is already in the public domain or owned by third parties, of which there's many. So one integral part of Local Context is the development of what we've called traditional knowledge labels. So TK labels are a way for Indigenous communities to add tags of information to any public materials in order to educate others about the access and use parameters of those materials. So importantly, the TK labels are a social intervention, not a legal intervention. In the first iteration of Mukurtu, we tried a legal intervention. Unfortunately, you can't relicense something that already is licensed under Western copyright law. We're still working on changing Western copyright law, but for now, today, we're focusing on the labels. So, for example, a seasonal label allows communities to tell others that these materials are generally only seen or heard during certain seasons. So, for example, we work with the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi in Michigan. They have a Mukurtu instance, and many of their songs are only supposed to be heard after the first snow falls. So they've used a TK label to designate that. We also find that the attribution label is the most common. It allows communities to clearly designate that they are the traditional owners, not Jesse Walter Fuchs, who happened to just hit record, or I'm not sure how he hit record on the wax cylinder, but I'm sure there wasn't a button at the time. But in any case, the traditional owners are able to designate themselves as the ones who should be attributed to. So, for example, here, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, using Mukurtu and the TK labels, have identified their attribution label, first in English and then in their own language. So Mukurtu and the TK labels together provide a tool for ethical and collaborative curation. So one example of what this looks like when you get an item into Mukurtu is from the Plateau People's web portal, which was funded by NEH that I direct at Washington State University. So we can see here that we partnered with the Northwest Museum of Art and Culture. They digitized materials that were chosen by the communities. This was chosen by the Warm Springs community. It's the root gathering bag. And then there's a very sort of classic description of it from the metadata at the MAC. And then if we tab over, however, we see we get a Warm Springs record. Within Mukurtu, you can have as many records as you need for any particular item. And now we see in the Warm Springs record that they've added their own title, Duck Basket. There's a protocol for access, in this case, community public access, meaning the community has designated it for public access. Importantly, there are no default access parameters in Mukurtu. You must even designate public. Finally, there are cultural narratives by 3 of community members, and there's also, if we scroll down, now available in the newest version of Mukurtu, there's a video that we recorded of the women talking about and giving traditional knowledge around this basket. So these are just a few examples of what institutions, scholars, technicians, and local communities can do through an intentional relationship that begins with a notion of digital return built on a foundation of purposeful practices that use technology and collections to form long-lasting relationships of respect. Relationships that lead to practices that understand the urgency of preserving collections is not only, or even foremost about the fragility of the wax cylinders or the reel-to-reels, but it's about the fragility of our own understandings of the past and the need to provide pathways for access and use that embody the spirit in which many of those materials were given and kept. Thank you.